Well, first of all, thank you, Harry, for inviting me to this hallowed ground. It's a privilege to be here. My father did actually visit Brooklands in 1930 as a 10-year-old boy, and he was quite enamoured by everything, the spectacle. So, as quite correctly Harry said, my father was in the desert, and he spoke very vocally about his desert experiences throughout his life. He died 7 years ago, aged 95, but my love of World War II history comes from him. This talk is more specifically about what it says on the tin, Special Desert Forces 1940 to 1943. So here we go, an overview of Special Forces in North Africa 1940 to 1943. Actually, what is the time check? Got it, okay. So, or if you're a soldier in campaign, you would say going up the blue. Look at those lovely bronze bodies in the middle of the desert with a brain gun, much like my brain gun down here. So, the Desert War was won by acronyms. We're here to talk today about the LRDG. Hands up who's heard of the LRDG? Great. And hands up who's heard of the SAS? Great, okay, testing the audience, right. So it's actually won by lots of other acronyms. I won't go through them all, but if you want to come up to me afterwards, I can recite them all, absolutely. These are secret services that were working for the Allies. No, so for today, we are concentrating on the Long Range Desert Group, which was started in June 1940, and the Special Air Services, which was nearly a year later in July 41. Briefly, I'm going to talk about Popski's private army. He's quite a character, and he worked with both those two special forces, and he's worth a mention. So these are working with their own autonomy, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. The story of how they came to fruition will be hopefully coming out within the next 3 hours. So the Long Range Desert Group had a motto, not by strength, by guile. And it's quite famous. The SAS motto is, who dares wins. But the SAS original motto was descend to defend. Not quite the same effect, I'm sure you would agree. But the LRDG also had their own second motto, which is there's a book called Providence Be My Guide, which was their second motto. So to summarize, the differences between LRD and SAS, the Long Range Desert Group were reconnaissance and road watch, and they led special forces into action. They also captured prisoners for intelligence, and they did a few guerrilla attacks, which we'll talk about later. One was Fort Mazurk and the Barca raid. SAS, quite famously, they're a bit more aggressive. They were initially parachutists, but they were more concentrated on demolition and raiding. They would attack fuel dumps, airfields, and occasionally they'd work with special boat services to attack from the sea. They also would work with other commando units, including PPA, Popski's private army, which was a very small special forces group. So I must start by saying I'm not a historian. I am only a history enthusiast. My source is reading, and these are my source books. For those who can't see, those are actually my original commando books. I've got a massive collection. These are only the ones, the desert ones. But I'm also interested in uniforms, and I am a costumier, or however you pronounce that. But yeah, I like playing with desert figures. These are 1/6 scale. These are action figurines. To be absolutely clear, they are not dollies. My lovely partner over there keeps saying, you've got to dust your dollies more often. They are not dollies. Anyway, these are 1/6 scale. I've actually made a 1:1 scale figurine. And here he is. Okay, his mother may have had some part in making him, but he's my full-scale dolly, action figurine, which I dress up and we go to history shows together. These are the actual books that I read. Now, I've read all of those at least once. The one book I haven't read is Montgomery of Alamein, and I've read most of them twice. So what I will say is, some things you read and you know are wrong, and it's very difficult to try and find out the path. To use a pun, it's a bit like a minefield, trying to find the truth amongst some of these writings. They're very few are first-hand. I discussed with Harry earlier that Alan Moorehead's African trilogy is first-hand. He was a journalist in campaign. That's a massive book, but it's a good read. Hopefully my talk today might instill somebody to do a bit more research. I'll happily discuss with any of you a recommended book reading list. Right, Desert Explorer. Let's get to the meat of the story. And in fact, let's meet the man. This is Ralph Bagnold. Now, you may not have heard of him, but he is very famous. He was a World War I veteran. He was a Royal Engineer, a geologist, and an explorer. Now, between the wars, he was still in the army. He was based in the Middle East, and he and four like-minded friends, a group of like-minded friends, between 1922 and 1932, they took 4 increasingly adventurous trips across the desert. They were all in the army, and they took combined leave to go and look for terra incognita, unknown land. So this is a Model A Ford, and they were purchasing these privately, and they were stripping off unnecessary the hood, the windscreen, doors for weight, and they would also add a water condenser, which is basically it's a closed water system. So when the radiator boils over, the steam goes into a condenser. It says what it says on the tin, it condenses the water. And when the engine cools down, the vacuum pulls the water back in. So it's a way of water conservation. In the desert, clearly there isn't a lot of spare water around. They also had, they also put extra leaf springs on it, because sometimes it's not desert, sometimes it's very rocky. And they also took lots of spare parts for mechanical breakdowns, as well as sand mats and sand channels, which you'll see in use later. They also followed quite literally in the tyre tracks of the light car patrol, which preceded them in 1916 and 1919. And they were tentatively exploring the desert, but also they were doing a little bit of raiding against the Senussi tribes. So these are the main players. These are Ralph Bagnold's associates. They are Pat Clayton, Bill Shaw, and Guy Prendergast. They were looking for the lost oasis of Zazura, a bit like Atlantis. They were also, Bagnold was also carrying out scientific studies. He ended up writing a book on the physics of sand and the movement of sand dunes. He became a global expert on sand. And also he devised ways of navigating across the Great Sand Sea, which is exactly like trying to navigate across a vast ocean. There's no landmarks. More on that later. So the Zazura Club. Again, they're looking for this lost oasis. Bagnold actually found many Neolithic remains in his trip, which definitely indicated that this area here, so this is Cairo, there's a better map coming up, trust me. This is the Chad border and Libya. They were basically crossing east to west across the Great Sand Sea. It will be clearer later. And they found many remains of Neolithic settlements. Definitely there was more life in the desert going back to the Stone Age. Oh, on their return, so they actually made a club called the Zazura Club, which were basically the hunting for the oasis. And they had a club at a place called Wadi Halfa, which is somewhere just down the edge of the Nile. I can't actually read it myself, but there's a place down there where they used to meet and just, regale each other of their tales of daring do. So navigation in the desert. This is a Bagnold sun compass, designed by Bagnold himself. Now, the problem with a normal compass is not only have you got your magnetic effect from your car, there's also magnetic ore in the desert, so you cannot rely on a normal compass. So this relies on the sun, which luckily enough in the desert there's quite a lot of. As long as you know where your latitude and your time of day, you get given a chart, and there's a little dial here around, and you set it to a certain degree, and you can be quite safely traveling on a path, and you can, because this is mounted on the front of your car, literally in front of the binnacle, if there was a binnacle, you'd be driving in a constant line, and you could check your angle of drive constantly, whereas on a compass you have to keep taking your readings. Now, because it works on the sun, it didn't work very well midday because the shadow might fall a little bit short. So typical British Army, they would brew up. They would have a big break during midday. Also, midday sun is quite a crazy time to be out anyway. So let's see if this will work. This is a little movie interlude. Here we go. Right, so this is real footage shot by Bagnold's team on the last 1932 trip. This is them using sand channels to free a car. This is actually somewhere near Uinat, which is a location that's nearly 800 miles southwest of Cairo, a long, long way away. Now, Bagnold devised this rope ladder device just to give it more grip. Now, in Bagnold's books called Libyan Sands, which is his actual book, and there's a copy of it on the table over there, which is great reading, he says they used to spend every 30 minutes they'd be digging up one of their vehicles. You can see the soft sand. It's 1,000 square miles of sand dunes. Some of the sand dunes are 30 meters high. Again, this is unknown territory. These are further than any Western man had ever been before. Arabs had obviously been here before. There were camel traps they were following, but mainly Western eyes had not seen this. In my eyes, it's almost like going to the moon in the 1920s. So as I said, some sand dunes are huge, and Bagnold was all the time discovering better ways to navigate through them and over them. And here they are having a little bit of fun. I can't imagine where all the crevices where that sand would get into, but maybe they're doing it just for the camera. Swim through sand. Okay, this is about to finish. And yep, there we go. Oh, there's a quick clip of a guy wearing snow goggles because they're using it because of the bright sun. So that's actual footage. Let's talk about Laszlo Almasi. He was a member of the Zazzura Club. He was a pilot. He was Hungarian, educated in England. He was explorer as well. And he actually flew over what he thought was the oasis of Zazzura in his aeroplane. A big green valley, but he could never find it on land. He could never get back to it. So whether he actually found Zazzura, don't know, but he may have got closest. Now he is German. Well, he's portrayed in the film The English Patient. And here he is, portrayed by slightly more debonair Ralph Fiennes. And Almasi was actually a German operative working with the Afrika Korps. Now, in reality, he wouldn't have fancied Kirsten Scott Thomas. He would have actually fancied Colin Firth. So he was batting for both sides in that respect and for the Germans. He actually had a failed attempt at inserting two Allied spies behind Allied lines called Operation Salem, and it failed, but evidently he still got an Iron Cross for it. So in this film, you might remember the Cave of Swimmers. I don't know if you've seen the film, but this is again evidence that in the deep desert, and this is Uwainet, this is Gulf Kabir, just near Uwainet, which is, as I said before, 800 miles southwest as a crow flies from Cairo. The Cave of Swimmers, again, indicates that it was once very wet. Now, these are two jeeps that retrace the steps of LRDG, and they did it, I think, about 10 years ago. Toby Savage is a chap that he wrote a book on this trip as well. He commissioned these two vehicles to be desertified, and they had a big support team of modern vehicles. But I've actually driven that Jeep on the right, and a new friend of mine actually just bought that Jeep there. So those are coming to my friends, my reenacting friends. Right, so anybody recognise this gentleman? Well, okay, so I just want to test the audience. Thank you very much. He does crop up later. You'll be not surprised. So then came the war. So Ralph Bagnold was on a troop ship going to East Africa in August 1942. His troop ship had a collision just outside Malta, and it put into Port Said for repairs. Now, when he got there, he sent a memo to Cairo to General Wavell saying, "Hey, look, I'm here. What can I do? Can I help? I kind of know the desert." But it was ignored. But in June 1940, he was given a posting in Cairo anyway, so he didn't go to East Africa. He was in Cairo, which when Italy declared war on England, well, the Allies, in June 1940, it became a bit more precedent for him to have action. So basically, he wrote a memo to GHQ again. This time, he relayed a story that he'd heard from this chap here, General Lorenzini. He was an Italian major that he met at Uwainet, that famous place we just had for the Cave of Swimmers. And General Lorenzini, in times of peace, he quite happily regaled Bagnold and his friends that if Italy were to declare war on Britain, we would almost certainly blow up the Aswan Dam and flood the Nile Delta. So with that information in Bagnold's new memo, it was much better received. So this is Archibald Wavell. He was a First World War veteran as well. He's only got one eye. So Bagnold's memory of the meeting with Wavell. General Wavell asked me, what would you do if you were to find no sign of activity? Without a thought, I said, how about some piracy on the high sea, on the high sand sea? At the word piracy, the strong, rugged face that seemed a bit stern suddenly broke into a broad grin. Can you be ready in 6 weeks? So Bagnold replied, I proposed a small group of modernised patrols that would be specially equipped with trained volunteers in desert-worthy vehicles. By applying all the techniques from our little private parties, we would have the extreme ability of 1,500 miles of travel entirely self-contained with water and food for several weeks. We could get into the emptiness in Libya by a back door I alone knew of, in the heart of the sand barrier. So, Wavell interrupted and said, of course there'll be opposition and delay. Wavell called the Chief of Staff, Bagnold needs a talisman, get this typed up for my signature right away, all heads of departments and branches, any wish or request made by Major Bagnold must be met at once without question. An advert was put in the newspapers asking for volunteers to engage in piracy on the Great Sand Sea. Now, at first, the volunteers were British Guardsmen and British Yeomanry, but it was later augmented by New Zealand and South African volunteers. Now, these were useful because they were experienced in working in harsh conditions. They were outside people and they were used to working in tough terrain and also working with farm vehicles. Now, bizarrely, this chap here is General Morshead. He actually forbade, somebody will correct me, I'm sure, Australians weren't allowed to volunteer. So there were no Australians in the Long Range Desert Group. By the way, his nickname is Ming the Merciless. You can see his lovely little Hitler tash there. So volunteers need to be resourceful. They need to be tough. Patrols need troopers to have more than one skill. They need navigation, mechanic, medic, signaller, etc. If they were out on a patrol, there could be a case of injury or possible death. They needed to cover for each other's skills. So, to summarise, LRDG would have extreme ability with expert navigation and the capability of appearing from nowhere, causing bloody mayhem, and disappearing back into nowhere. So, they were very far from the regular army. You can see there are no regulation uniforms here. They are wearing whatever is comfortable. They are wearing the equivalent of my sheepskin here, could be goatskin. Bear in mind that in the desert, it's blinking hot during the day, but it reached 0 degrees at night. So they were obviously had to experience both extremes. So they would be wearing warm stuff, as well as the lovely KD shorts, which I'm sporting here. And the headgear varies from tanker's beret to SD cap to wherever that is, a rag. And this is an Arab headdress. This is a keffiyeh or a shamag. And this is a gal that holds it on. This is clearly Arab headdress. And it is very useful because, one, it helps disguise them as possibly indigenous, but also, basically, you wrap your face around it. In the case of a sandstorm, you put your goggles on, you wrap your face up, and you're protecting yourself from the attrition of sand. It's like having a sandblast on your face. Sandstorms were awful. So they were learning from the indigenous Arabs what to wear. The LRDG never numbered more than 350 men, and it had a 50-man Cairo in headquarters, which Bagnold commanded, and later he put Prendergast, Guy Prendergast, in charge in the actual field. Right. So new young recruits were a bit dubious because these men, Clayton, Shaw, Bagnold, Prendergast, they're all in their mid-50s, and they're all basically old men to the soldiers. But basically, when they realised that these men had the skills and knowledge to do bloody mayhem in the middle of the desert, they earned their respect. Patrols of roughly 24 men, 2 officers. They had one Ford 800-watt command car, and they would have had, which later became Jeeps, and then they would have had 4 to 6 30-hundredweight Chevy lorries, which you'll see plenty of later. So John Easton Smith is another one of the original long-range desert groups officers. So, as I said, the regulation didn't exist. They wore whatever comfortable. They would often wear captured clothes. In the beginning, they'd often come across, when the Italians were routed, they would be able to take Italian rations and Italian clothes. Occasionally, the clothes were more comfortable. And that also was quite useful in case you came across later on when the Germans got involved. To blag yourself as Italian was quite easy. Anybody seen a film called Play Dirty? It's special forces, exactly like this. They were wearing the opposition's clothes to try and blend in, as well as being more comfortable than the British serge. The British uniform of that era was very itchy and uncomfortable. Right, hardtack biscuit. This has been a staple diet of the British Army for well over 100 years. I mean, this happens to be Huntley and Palmer's, which is a biscuit factory just around the corner from where I live. It's made from water, salt, and flour. And it's not meant to be eaten. I think it's meant to be thrown at your enemy. Soldiers used to, condensed milk was another ration you would get in your pack, and they used to actually soak it overnight in carnation evaporated milk, and it would end up as being a porridge called a biscuit burgo. It's the only way you can eat it. I have actually eaten one of these dry, and you had to do it piece by piece, and it took me 35 minutes and cost me 2 teeth. So Ralph Bagnold, in charge of his men, he quite obviously realised that those biscuit rations, because the army would have literally, they would have biscuits, jam and cheddar for a ration for lunch. These men were doing arduous work, so they were spoilt. They had a food that was high in carbs, high in fat, and you can't see here because it's so small, but they've got bacon, they've got salmon, sardines, fresh fruit. They've got a lovely smorgasbord of proper food there. Right, just going to take a glug of my my lovely brew here. Okay, so next slide is quite a good one. So this is a map of their operations. You've got Cairo over here. I actually just highlighted, you can't read it, but it says Cabrit. That's actually the operational base from the SAS when they get involved. They're not involved just yet. So these are, the blue ones are the operational oases. Was it oasi? Anyway, so an oasis, here, they are over several miles. There's tens of thousands of people in them. It's not your classic, beautiful little pool of water with 2 or 3 palm trees. They are huge sources of fresh water. And as I said, the famous ones they used are Tazabo, Kufra, Zelo, Siwa, and Jalo. Siwa is the one that was used most often because it's closest to, this is general headquarters for Allied. It was basically the closest and it was the most used. Now the other oases here, they were occasionally overrun later on in the war. Mazurk is way over here. Oh, by the way, this is Uinat. This is where the Cave of Swimmers is. This is also used as a stopping point, but not so much. It's not an oasis. And Mazurk will be mentioned later. Look how far away Mazurk is from Cairo. That's got to be that's 250 miles. That's got to be 1,200 miles, I reckon, or 1,000 miles at least. So now at these oases, there was lots of flies. And the troopers hated it because they just pestered them. It's a job to eat your food without eating a fly. So they're actually quite happy to be on patrol and just to get away with the pestilence that were at the oases. So the Long Range Desert Group was expanded to more patrols. There was T Patrol, W Patrol, R for Rhodesian, G for Guards, S for South African, Y for Yeomanry. And the Chevy trucks took names from the first letter of the patrol. So quite famously, many of you might have seen the Chevy truck. It is Waikaka. It is the only existing truck that we know that's been repatriated, and it's in the Imperial War Museum, W, because it's W Patrol. So T and W were more raiding, while R Patrol was actually more support unit. So Mazurk, I showed you on the last slide, it's very far away. This is the very first successful raid that the first raid that the LRDG did. And they took their Chevy trucks and they went to Fort Mazurk. And the Italians actually came out to greet them, thinking they were friendlies. I mean, you can imagine, they're so far away from their base. They were hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. But what happened was the LRD opened up with a 20 mm Beretta, and they actually shot the Italian general in his car, but unfortunately they also shot his wife and 2 kids. That really affected the patrolmen, troopers, because they didn't want to kill innocents. Now the Free French were also helping the Allies at this stage, and they joined from Lake Chad. And General Duranro was unfortunately killed in that. Only 2 people were killed in that raid, and one was the French general. Now, General Leclerc replaced him, and I only found General Leclerc, some of you might know if you've read, he became quite a famous general. That's not his real name. He changed his name to protect his family that was still in occupied France. These are pictures of the Mazerk raid, and they obviously used a little bit of demolition there. So following the Mazerk raid, there was a raid on Kufra Oasis, which you saw on the map, it's further east. Now this is a picture of Teddy Mitford. He actually got the military cross for his action at Kufra, and Bagnold recruited Teddy because of his previous knowledge of the Oasis. He's quite famous, well, his sister's a bit more famous, the Mitford sisters, Nazi fanatics. One married Sir Oswald Mosley with Herr Hitler as the guest of honor. So they did the wrong thing, he did the right thing. Right, so after that raid, so the Italians are still, they're calling the Long Range Desert Force the Pattuglia, if I pronounce that right, Fantasia, which is Ghost Patrol. As previously said, they were the remit was to come out of nowhere, cause bloody mayhem, return to nowhere. But this time they were followed by the Italians in a plane like an Italian Caprioni. And they were later followed on foot, on the ground, by the Italian Auto-Saharan unit. Now they were the equivalent of the Long Range Desert Group. As a quick aside, this vehicle here is designed for the desert. It's got huge wheels, it's got loads of jerry tanks here, it's got jerry cans here, it's got, in total, it's got 400 litres of fuel and 80 litres of water on board. Now you'd think that was a brilliant vehicle. Now the Long Range Desert Group were using some of those in their, they tested ones they found abandoned, but they were useless, they kept breaking down. But anyway, the Auto-Saharan were following the retreating Long Range Desert Group, and they followed them to a place called Jebel Sharif where they attacked them. And T Patrol was attacked at a place called Jebel Sharif, we just said, on the 31st of January 1941. And some trucks were destroyed in the initial attack, some people died, and the leader, Pat Clayton, one of the original Zazura Club members, was captured. This is the same Chevy you saw in the front of the picture. Now it's still there, and it's left there as a memorial to the fallen. Right, there's more, literally more. This is Moore's March. This became Long Range Desert Group legend. He is a New Zealand trooper, and he was the first to receive a Distinguished Conduct Medal in the Second World War. He actually marched 210 miles across deserts with little food or water. He was mentioned in dispatches. Other special services copied his march, but this was his famous march. He didn't want to surrender. He had no vehicle. He chose, sorry, I will read this because this text is quite small. He and 3 other survivors walked through the desert. He walked, instead of walking 70 miles to Italian forces to be captured, he decided to walk the opposite direction, a potential 290-mile trek away from Italians back to what he hoped was Allied lines. Other guardsmen with him were John Easton, Guardsman Alexander Winchester, and ROAC Alfred Tye. They had no other supplies except a 2-gallon tin of water and 2-pound jar of jam. Doesn't specify whether it's marmalade or raspberry, but that's what they had. T, he had been left behind, injured like Captain Oates style, on the 5th day of the march. Easton already died. Winchester was delirious and left behind. A French patrol plane was sent out and spotted small groups, airdropping food and a bottle of lemonade to the 2 survivors, but the 2 survivors did not notice the food and only had the remains of 13 ml of lemonade in one of the water containers. T was picked up by a French patrol 4 days later and was able to inform them which direction the rest had walked. When the patrol found Moore, he was clear-headed and uninjured except for the shrapnel in his foot. He was headed for Tekro, 80 miles away. He was barefooted and slightly annoyed at being stopped, as he'd calculated he was only 2 days from his goal. He had walked 210 miles in all. Allegedly, he is still referenced by SAS Special Forces training to this day. That's what I'm saying. In New Zealand, tough people. So Guy Prendergast was one of the original Zazura members, and he became the leader in the field. He privately bought 2 Waco planes to assist the Long Range Desert Group. They were, the Waco planes were used to supply injured and supplies. They'd also help, they would use the planes for water dumps and fuel dumps. But funnily enough, the RAF refused to service them because they weren't RAF planes, but the Cairo local mechanics did a good job. So, vehicles. This is your standard Chevy 15 by 32 two-wheel drive, 1,300 weight Chevy truck. Again, following the Model A ethos, they've stripped off all the excess. They've got a water condenser just here, and they would have a command vehicle. This is actually a Ford 800 weight. This is one that seems to be stuck, but that was the pilot vehicle, one pilot vehicle to 2 or 4 or 6 of the Chevy trucks. The Chevy trucks would be converted to take lots of fuel as well. And they would also have, at least one of the vehicles in the patrol would be a mechanic's vehicle with lots of spare springs, axles, all the things you'd break on a long trip through the desert. They used heavier 3-ton lorries to do water drops and fuel dumps. And they would have 1 radio truck per patrol. They had to be careful because the Germans used a radio sourcing. They used triangulation with 2 radio bands. They could triangulate a radio signal, so they had to be very brief in their transmissions back to GHQ. Right, rocket launch. So this is a bit quirky. Who's been on a roller? Some have been on a roller coaster. When you come up to crest a roller coaster, you just look into the air. So it's very similar when you are using Bagnold's techniques to drive up a sand dune. The technique that he devised was you have to drive a sand dune square and fast. There was evidently a little crust on the sand dune, and you've got to stick to that crust. And basically, if you imagine those big Chevy trucks, you're in there, you're sitting up, and you just got to go for it. So occasionally, the trucks would fly over the top. And if the truck was unbalanced, it might tip over, causing injury, or at least it would be a struggle to get the truck back on 4 wheels. But if you don't go fast enough, you get this, and you get stuck. So that's how not to do it. It must be quite a thing to try and get that just right. So there's also sand mats. They use sand mats as they did when they were crossing the desert back in between the wars. And here's a picture of sand mats being used as a windbreak. They were nothing if not resourceful. So briefly, the sand is not all sand. You've got this basalt rock, and this is the rocky surface that would play havoc with your suspension. So, quick, let's play logo game. So, the Long Range Desert Group was originally called the Long Range Patrol, hence the other acronym there. And the Scorpion was designed by somebody who had never seen a Scorpion in their life. My pet Scorpion's on the table over there. If Harry likes to show my Scorpion up to the audience? Well, so yeah, so that's my real pet Scorpion, and it's a lot skinnier than that one. So they eventually adapted it to look a bit more genuine, but the SAS, I know they're not in campaign yet, but let's talk about the SAS logo. People tend to think this is a winged dagger. It's actually flaming Excalibur sword. It was designed by Bob Tate, who was a SAS officer. But this is the special wings that was invented for the SAS. Every parachutist gets wings if they complete however many jumps. And this was designed from... Stick with me on this one. This is the Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo. Shepherd's spelled correctly. That's how you spell the chap's name who built it. It was an unofficial GHQ in Cairo for officers and anybody who was anybody. It was the place to be, as well as spies. Italian and German nationals were still allowed in Cairo, and it was a place to get intel. So behind the reception of Shepherd's, you got... you can see the logo. Can you see? This is the wings of Ra. This is the sun god, this Egyptian myth. The sun god is carried across the sky on the wings of an eagle or falcon, east to west every day. And this was the colour and design chosen by Jock Lewis, who we'll talk about shortly. He was a founder of the SAS. He was an Oxford graduate. and he chose Oxford blue, and David Stirling was a Cambridge graduate, and he's choose the light blue. So again, the falcon carries the sun east to west, which coincidentally, or maybe not, that's the same direction that the forces were fighting, the Axis forces, east to west. So this is a Willis Jeep, happens to be my Jeep, and it's photographed in my studio. It's got, again, it's got a very low profile. Now, these things here are called bailout bags, and they are there so that if your Jeep overturns or is shot up, you've got your bare essentials, you've got food, first aid, you can just rip them off the side and do a runner. Now, the SAS obviously had Jeeps, but they're slightly different. They've got more guns because they like to shoot. LRDG, we're not quite so aggressive as that, but you can see this Jeep here has got twin Vickers here, it's got a 50 cal Browning here, and it's got another Vickers on the driver's pintle. So three Vickers in total and a 50 cal Browning. And they've also got more fuel loaded because they tend to need to go greater distance. Without the support of the LRDG, they would sometimes go further. Now, those Vickers machine guns are very special. They came off aircraft, and they've got a very nice light form factor. They take 303 bullets. But when you're raiding an airfield, a normal copper nickel bullet will go through petrol tank without sparking. So they used Buckingham rounds, which are a form of incendiary round, and they would put a higher ratio of normal tracer rounds, but also the Buckingham round, which is that one there, to ignite petrol tanks. And they were very successful. Imagine 8, sometimes they'd go in a V formation down a runway, down an aerodrome, and they would be firing out either side at planes that were parked in enemy airfields. Now, let's go back to one enemy we know as El Duce. Mussolini, Italian leader, fascist leader, he erected this thing called Marble Arch. This was his Arc de Triomphe. This is on the road between Tripoli and Benghazi. It's 30 meters tall, and it stands out like a sore thumb across the flat desert. So he erected this before the war in celebration of his valiant success against the Senussi tribes. So these are Senussi tribes. He defeated them with armored cars and machine guns against tribesmen who had camels, horses, and flintlock pistols, flintlock muskets. So yeah, well done, Mussolini. You deserve that big thing there. But it's very useful because it was able to, the Allies were able to use it as a landmark, literally. So because of that big landmark, this was actually the scene of one of the best things that Long Range Delta Group did. They did a thing called Road Watch. So between March 1942 and July 42, they ran a continuous watch of the road, noting enemy movements, vehicles, regiments, numbers, anything that's important, they would send back to GHQ. Now, it was quite arduous because it was so far away from their front line. So what it meant it was, at the most extreme, they had 2 weeks travel to get to this position to watch the road. And then the patrol would be there for 1 week, taking it in turns to watch the road and then sending back signals. But then, so there'd be 2 weeks in travel, 1 week watching, and then also they've got to get back. So in total, it's a 5-week circular system. There's always 3 patrols on continuous rotation. It was quite arduous. They really didn't like it, but it was very, very useful. Now you can see there, they're hunkering down, get some shade, but during the night, they'll be using a thing called a tropple coat. The tropple coat is very heavy, it's Kapok. I've got one of these. It's exactly like wearing a lump of cardboard. They're very, very uncomfortable, but they were necessary to keep them dry and, warm. So, can you spot the truck? Well, yeah, you sort of can, but if you're a plane, 50 miles away, you might miss it. You might think it's shrub. So they were very good at camouflage. Oh, one thing they used to do, they used to drive to a target, they used to reverse, spur off, and then rub away their spur. So basically, anybody following the tracks, they end in a dead end. Right, so who is this? You might not know who this is, but this is a Special Intelligence Services spy for the Allies. He's Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark. He is a cross-dresser. He was a very astute spy master. And he actually had we're talking about the SAS now. He actually had a fake SAS. He actually was he worked with deception, and he invented a group called the Special Services. Yes, it really was the SS. And he had fake radio traffic, and he had the odd wounded soldier. He used to a fake soldier with a fake wound, or maybe a real wound. I can't quite imagine they'd break a leg, but they would put parachutists in hospitals and to try and spread the rumour that there was a parachute regiment being made in North Africa. Also, Dudley Clark would be a regular at Shepherd's Hotel, and he would quite happily talk too loudly about his parachutists. Here, careless talk, if it's allowed, is great if it's for deception. But before the SAS, there was another commando force in North Africa, and it was Lay Force. This is Robert Lucky Laycock's commando unit that was trained in Scotland, and they did further action in North Africa. Now, in charge of them was Bill Sterling. We know David Sterling. This is Bill, the older brother. And Bill is on the left at a handsome 6'6", and David Sterling is a short ass at 6'4". And he was the younger brother of 5 children, and he was always basically trying to play catch up. We'll talk about him a bit later. But Laycock was working with Peter Fleming on SOE assignments, and eventually Lay Force commandos were disbanded. They did a few actions, but basically they were stood down. And all these commandos that are trained, Jock Lewis, and the names will come up soon, they were eager for action. So Jock Lewis was one of those commandos, and he went to start parachute training at Fuka Airport near Mersa Matruh, which is on the north coast of Africa, not about 50 or 80 miles east of the Libyan border, still in Egypt. He was training at Mersa Airfield, and David Sterling also had the same idea. And Dudley Clark met Sterling, and there was an obvious symbiosis to try and get the real parachutist to take over from his fake parachutist. So basically, Sterling, I just forgot this little bit here, Sterling had an idea. Sterling came from a landed Scottish gentry, and he was a grouse shooter, and he thought his idea was to destroy the aeroplanes on the ground before they got off in the air. Don't let the RAF try and shoot them down. Let's get them when they're vulnerable. So he wanted to parachute into airdromes and capture and shoot them. So Lay Force commandos stood down. Sterling did blag his way into General Rich's office. Those who have seen SAS Rogue Heroes, he didn't do it on crutches, but he did blag his way in. But General Rich knew Sterling and knew Sterling's family because he'd been grouse shooting on the estate. So Ritchie was keen. Commander-in-Charge Wavell was also keen. He liked the idea, but unfortunately he was stood down because Operation Brevity, Operation Battle Axe had failed to relieve Tobruk. By this stage, Tobruk had been under siege for many months, and Churchill wanted it relieved. Wavell had failed, so Wavell was replaced by General Auchinleck, which is the Orc down here. And he green-lit the SAS. So the SAS doing some training here in the desert before they managed to get into a plane. So they eventually did get a real assignment. Their first assignment was Operation Squatter, 16th of November, 1941. Now this is before the Operation Crusader, which was the planned relief of Tobruk. And the idea was that special forces were going to go behind enemy lines to cause bloody mayhem again. Now, Sterling's unit was originally named L Detachment, and that was again a little deceit, thinking that the enemy, if they heard L Detachment, there might be A to K. Absolute rubbish, obviously. So the first code name, the first operation was called Squatter, and unfortunately it was due to launch with a storm, 60-mile-an-hour winds, and heavy rain. They were advised not to go. So David Sterling was actually in charge of this L Detachment at the time, and he gave them a go, no-go situation. And all the men, they were all the commandos that were keen for action. They knew if they'd been stood down for this action, they may not get a second chance. They were keen to get feet on the ground against the Germans again. So they all said, let's go. They knew the risks. So out of the 55 men, not many survived. One plane was shot down, killing 15 soldiers and crew. Many missed the LLZ, the landing zone, and many were lost or captured. Now, when you have a parachute, you have a big release button on your chest. So if you land on your back, you can release the button and release your parachute because the 61-hour wings were dragging them. If, unfortunately, you're on your face and you are dragged by your big parachute, catches in a 60-mile-an-hour wind, you are being dragged, unfortunately, face forward. You cannot get your hands up to release the buckle. So, unfortunately, they were dragged to the deaths. Fairly horrific. I hope you've all had your food already. Right, so complete failure. They lost their weapons, they lost their explosives in the drop. Out of the 55 men that started, 22 made it back to the rendezvous. They had to march across the desert, and they were actually they were retrieved by the Long Range Desert Group. Here they are. These are the original 22. They are called the originals. This is Sterling here in the middle. Paddy Mayne you may have heard of. We'll talk about him shortly. And this is just another Bill Fraser, a very important officer here. This photograph was taken as they were rescued by the Long Range Desert Group. So, talking about SAS in more detail, officers of some note is obviously Robert Blair, nicknamed Paddy Mayne. He was capped for Ireland in rugby. He was awarded the DSO, famously with 3 bars, no VC. He was described as magnificent physique and a very quiet fellow who wouldn't hurt a fly until you saw him roused. He had a reputation as being a psychopath, a violent psychopath. He did like a drink, but we'll discuss him briefly in the summary. So another officer is John Steele. This is Jock Lewis, who we said already. He was the one who actually had the idea of training parachutists in Fuka Aerodrome. He actually had a German girlfriend, and he was fluent in German. I mean, look at that look there. He could have been a movie star. I don't know what he's doing as bloody commando. Sadly, he died in action in December 1941, but he invented a Lewis bomb, which I'll just do a little bit of show and tell. So, I mean, they're trying to destroy airplanes on airfields, and when they fail to go, if they've driven down an airfield and they've missed some of the planes, they would put, this is not a real one, by the way, but this would be exactly what Jock Lewis made them make. They are bombs made of half dynamite, half thermite, a little bit of diesel oil, and iron filings. So they've got a pencil fuse. You would crimp the pencil fuse, and the timer on a pencil fuse can vary from 30 minutes to 24 hours. They would place it on the wing above the petrol tank and skedaddle off. And these were damn effective. Right, so fortunately Lewis invented that, but he didn't make it through the rest of the war. A second raid on Tammet. This is where Paddy Mayne got one of the reputations as being just a psychopath. He basically ran out of Lewis bombs, he ran out of ammunition, and he decided to go into a plane cockpit and rip the dashboard out with his bare hands. And he actually kept one of the dashboards as a bit of a memento. And that actually happened. That's not apocryphal, that actually happened. So, briefly, I'm just going to take a sip of my tea. Anybody asleep yet? Right. So we briefly mentioned a guy earlier about special services. This is a very brief thing just to discuss Vladimir Penyakov, quite well decorated. His nickname was Popski, purely because Bill Shaw from the Long Range Desert Group couldn't pronounce Penyakov. They joked about what he wanted to call his small squad of only 50 men. It was technically number 1 demolition squad, but he was actually called Popski's. So it joked, what do you want to call your little raiding army? He said, well, why don't you call it Popski's Private Army? It says personal up there, but that's a mistake. So he said, why don't you call it Popski's Private Army? It's a joke. He said, do you know what, I quite like that. Let's stick with that. So PPA, if you ever come across it, they've got the astrolabe as their logo. And they went on to fight in Europe. But Popski, he actually had his hand shot off by a German machine gun. So he's got a hook. Now, famously, he was fluent in many languages. The PPA only had roughly 40 men, mixture of 5 officers and some Arabs. But famously, he drove into a German fuel dump and said, could you please fill up my Jeep? And they quite politely obliged. You could get away with that. Right, myth-busting. We are into the final straits, nearly. So myth-busting, we all know David Sterling from Reputation, well, some of you do. He was the instigator. He was the Cambridge scholar and Paddy Mayne was the everyday man, sportsman, rugby player, boxer. They didn't really get on, and this is why. Sterling was I can't say it. I've got my wrong teeth in today. Sterling was slipshod and reckless, but he was very charismatic, and he had a magnetic personality, and he could persuade anybody, he could persuade people to do anything. That was his one key trait. He never really investigated using new weapons or even radio communications. Both of those are LRDG strengths. Bagnold did both of these in the LRDG, as well as make friends with the indigenous tribes, the Tanusi. So they were his friends, whereas Sterling was a bit more egotistical, didn't care. So Sterling was nicknamed the Phantom Major by Randolph Churchill, who was Winston's son, who was with them. And he wrote back to Churchill saying, oh, what a fantastic chap Sterling is. All we need is more of him and we'll win the war. So he was captivated by his own hubris. Being 6'4", Sterling was sometimes a bit slow to move, and he had a nickname of the Giant Sloth. His bravado and lack of planning put men regularly at risk and cost lives. Paddy was a far greater leader. Now Paddy here, he's seen in normal service dress, without a big beard, he looks like a normal man. He was a normal man, he was a born leader. He was intelligent, articulate, he exuded confidence and reliability. He was compassionate to his men. He didn't risk lives unnecessarily. His men respected this, and they would have gone into hell with him, basically. He was born to special services. He considered it an extension of sports. He was a massive sportsman, as we remember. And most stories of his extreme behaviour are false. After Paddy died a bit early, he died when he was 40 in a drink-driving accident of his own doing. Unfortunately, so he died a bit young. But Sterling was able to make up his own agenda after Paddy's death, and he did do a bit of what I call it, just some negative publicity. I can't find the right word, but negative publicity to make Sterling seem better and Paddy worse. But Paddy was the proper leader of the SAS. A classic main quote, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Paddy was on a raid with the LRDG that had gone wrong. Now, I can't find this quote anywhere else, but as I just referenced there, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. The LRDG raid driver was taking Paddy away from the airfield that they'd failed to attack, and Paddy asked to go back and to try once more. And the driver said to him, that was a crazy idea. And Paddy simply said, crazy is our business. Sounds great, but I can't find it actually in any book, so it's just a good story. So, Axis blagging. As I said, we are working, well, the LRDG are working hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, so it's quite common for a vehicle of either side to be broken down, run out of fuel, and be repurposed by the enemy. So, for instance, here we've got a Daimler Dingo with a German sign on it. So, if you were Long Range Desert Group or SAS behind enemy lines, you would have reversible insignia on your bonnet. So, when a plane came over, you could simply put on the right headgear, switch over the roundel and wave quite happily to your friends in the plane. And fingers crossed they don't suss your enemy, because again, you are so far behind enemy lines, it'd be an unusual sight. So Rommel actually repatriated a British vehicle. He used a AEC command vehicle, a Mammoth. And this was his command vehicle that he had in the deserts. He literally was always in the front of his men. He led from the front. Rommel was a great general, well respected with his soldiers, but he unfortunately ended up, during Operation Crusader, he got lost and he got the wrong side of the Libyan-Egyptian border. And he found himself amongst Allied vehicles. But because he was in a British vehicle, he quite calmly just drove away. Right, so not too far to go. Lost Sterling. So we've had a Lost Fox. The Desert Fox was nicknamed for Rommel. This is the Lost Sterling. This is David Sterling in the middle. He's having a tea break with Mike Sadler, who will just wrench, and again he'll come up. This is 1943, Tunisia. The last picture of Sterling before he was captured. He was captured at Gabe's Gap in Tunisia. He was on an ego trip. He was desperate to be the first Allied officer to meet the American forces coming from the West Coast. Operation Torch had landed in November, and he was trying to catch up with them advancing through Tunisia. Unfortunately, he got captured, and he ended up in, what's the name of this prison? It probably says it there. You cheated, you read it. So yeah, off-flag 4C was Colditz, Sterling out of the game completely, rest of the war in Colditz. Now, Mike Sadler, who you just saw with David Sterling, this is Mike Sadler. He's quite famous because he was the very good LRDG navigator, and he was seconded to the SAS, which is why he was with Sterling there. So he worked with both teams. And this is him, last man standing. This is him at 103. Now, unfortunately, Mike died only in January of this year, age 103. But I think he would have some stories, and he had a great innings. Right, so definitely on the final straight now. I can't mention the SAS or LRDG without mentioning this chap. So after Sterling got captured, Paddy was in charge of a subdivision called the Special Raiding Services, but the Special Boat Services was another subdivision, and this chap here, Anders Larsen, he was in charge, Scandinavian, I think he's Norwegian, can't remember, I think he's Norwegian. He was the equivalent of Paddy Mayne. He was a hard son of a bitch, brave as anything, and he was the only non-Commonwealth recipient of the British VC during World War II. But he sadly died in 1945. So, take a deep breath. We are nearly there. Summary. The SAS was formed from an amalgam of different people's ideas. The older brother Bill is often uncredited for his input. Bill Sterling was more of a founder than David. Bill was also the intellectual force. Paddy was definitely the physical force, and David was the salesman. And the best thing that happened to the SAS was Sterling's capture. Popski disliked Sterling because he was slipshod, but he really revered the Long Range Desert Group, and Popski worked with both. So in summary, again, the LRDG called the SAS parachutists because they couldn't parachute for toffee. And they in turn called them the taxi service because that's what they did. So in the last couple of slides, there would be no SAS without the LRDG. They were completely intertwined. Once they learned they couldn't parachute, they were 100% reliant on the skills and navigation of the Long Range Desert Group. So this is SAS Jeep, and this is Long Range Desert Group convoy. Right, they say a man dies twice. Once when the physical body dies, and second when his name is no longer mentioned. Well, these are Bagnold's dunes. I said that Bagnold was an expert on sand dunes, on the movement of sand, creation of dunes. Does anybody know where these dunes are? They're on Mars. So NASA, quite kindly, has named dunes of Mars after Bagnold. So there you go. It's all over. For you poor sods, the war waffle is now over. And that was a Lone Rat presentation. I thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Richard. Big hand here for Richard the Lone Rat. I think he gets a special round of applause for wearing that headdress all night in the heat. That was showing some of the determination from the Long Range Desert Group. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. Hopefully some of you are coming to the Cold War presentation over here in the Napier room in, I think, next week. So see you some then, and thank you very much indeed for coming.